This task calls for a procedure that will go through a text file, identify where the longest word or words are, and then display them. So in order to get going with the task, there's a couple of things we have to do. We'll have to set up a procedure, but we'll also have to build a text file so that we can test the procedure later. So let's build the procedure by putting in the words private and static first, and don't worry too much about the meaning of those at GCSE level. Since it's a procedure, it will not be returning any values, and we can call it something like show longest words. The task is not clear on whether the identity of the text file needs to be passed in as a parameter, or whether the user should be permitted to select the file when the program runs. So in order to generate a working solution, let's go for the path of least resistance here. Let's just hard code the identity of the text file into the procedure. Later, we can test the procedure directly from the main method simply by calling it. Calling a procedure is a perfectly legitimate line of code in its own right, because we're not expected to return a value and, for example, store it in a variable or anything like that. So now that we've got the general infrastructure set up, before we can really start coding, we have to have an identifiable text file that we can work with. So let's go here and let's create a new empty file, and let's call it GCSE number 9.txt, because as programmers working in the NetBeans environment, when you're creating an empty file like this, you take control of the file type. Okay, next we want to be able to populate this with a list of words. Now obviously we could just sit here and type them, but this website makes so much more sense. This is lorem ipsum. This is a made-up language, something similar to Latin. Sounds a bit like Latin. So what we can do is, let's just type in a number here. Let's put in 400. Let's pick words, and this will generate us 400 words of lorem ipsum text. And if we just take a copy, we don't strictly speaking need all of it, but let's just take the whole thing. What we can now do is go back to NetBeans, and if we paste it in, you'll see that there are some new line characters separating the various paragraphs. Let's use delete and then backspace to join those together. Same thing again, delete and then backspace on each of these blank lines. Delete to bring the line up, and backspace to join it to the previous one. Delete and backspace. So we've got it all to fit on one line of code. Let's press the home button to go back to the start. Next, we'll use Control and H, which calls up the find and replace tool. Let's replace all of the spaces with just a comma character, and that means that the word separator is no longer just a simple space. Now that we've done that, let's also replace all of the full stops with just nothing. Let's just replace all of those with just nothing. And finally, let's look for situations where we've ended up with two commas, because previously there was a comma separated by a space, and the spaces have now been turned into commas. So if we identify any patterns where there's a double comma, let's just replace it with, for example, a single comma, and hit replace all. Okay, that should by now have sorted out the text file so that now we have one continuous line of text and everything is now ready to go for testing purposes. I'm just going to hold the right arrow key for a little while here just to double check if there's any patterns that have crept in that we don't really want to see. And no, as a general rule it seems to be okay. I'll press the end key now on the keyboard, and going all the way to the end there are no rogue characters dangling at the end. So we'll just close the text file at this point. Okay, let's get going with developing the procedure. Here's our procedure here. It's called show longest words. So the first thing that we're going to do is open the text file, and actually I'll just close the find and replace tool down the bottom to create a bit more screen space, a bit more vertical space in which to work. Okay, in order to open the text file, we're going to have to build a file variable. So let's build a file variable, and we can call it word bank, for instance, and we'll say equals a new file, and then what we're going to have to do inside the brackets is provide a string that tells us the path and the file name. So in order to retrieve that, let's right click here, call up the properties. I think that's going off screen actually, but when I right click, properties is down at the bottom. Sorry if you can't see that. We're going to go dot 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 and we're going to single click this. I'm using Control and C on the keyboard, and I'm going to close both of those. And now when I go back here and use the paste command, Control and V, it's going to put in the full path to the file as well as the name of the text file itself. Thanks to NetBeans as an IDE, it has automatically replaced the single backslash which is used in the Windows environment with a double backslash, because the Java language requires a double backslash because the backslash is used to form escape sequences. Finally, the class called file is not instantly recognized by the Java language and has to be imported. So I'm going to use the IDE to help me here, and I'm going to use the little tool over here, the light bulb, to say add an import statement for java.io. Now, up here, I know that I'm also going to need a file reader in a moment, so I'm just going to import everything. So file and file reader can both be imported at the same time, instead of having separate import statements for them both. Okay, taking a new line, continuing the opening of the file process, then we're going to say file reader, and we'll just call it fr equals new file reader, and we're going to connect this to our word bank variable, which is the file itself. So the exception handling is going to be required here, because opening a file could go wrong, for instance if the path was invalid. So for an easy life, I'm just going to go up to the header of the method where the method prototype is, and I'm going to say, in fact, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to let NetBeans do the honors. I'm going to say add a throws clause. I'm going to let it put it in for me rather than me sitting typing it all out. Okay, so this should have allowed us to open the file in read mode, ready to read in the data. Next, I'm going to go down and I'm going to put in a line of code that will close the file. In order to do that, I'm going to use fr.close, because if you shut off the file reader, then that will mean that the text file is closed. Here it's in an unreported exception of IO nature is needed, so we're going to do the same thing again and add a throws clause up here by simply listing it alongside the other type of exception that could occur when trying to deal with file handling. And so we're now ready for the in-between step. This is the part where we read in the data from the file. Now, in order to do this, what we're going to do is read in pretty much the entire file into one string, and then we're going to do the rest of the programming based on the string after the file has been closed and can be put beyond use. So to get going with this, we're going to say, let's build a string, and we're going to call it contents. I'm going to initialize it to be the empty string so that there is at least something there that we can add to. Next, we're going to start iterating through each of the characters in the file. And we're going to begin by setting up an integer variable called character read, and we're going to go ahead and do what we call a priming read. We're going to read in the first character that we find in the file. So to do that, we're going to use fr, and we're going to call the read method, and the read method is going to read in a single character and store it as an integer. So in this case, we're going to say that while the character read is not equal to the integer -1, which would symbolize that we've reached the end of the file and that we've just read the end of file character. As long as that's all okay, then what we're going to do is we're going to take the string of contents of the file, and we're going to say that we're going to concatenate on the character equivalent of whatever the character was that has just been read from the file. Next, we're going to proceed to read in the next character, and as long as we don't stumble upon a -1, we'll end up going in and adding that character as well. By the end of several iterations, that should have read in the entire text file. Next, what we can do is we can convert the string into an array of strings. So for example, if we were to have the string that had a, b, c, then that would end up converting it into an array where we had a followed by b followed by c, all treated as separate strings. Strictly speaking, I should be using double quotes there, of course. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to build an array of strings, and it's going to be called words. And the way we're going to develop words is we're going to take the string of contents taken from the file, and we're going to call the split method spl, and we're going to split it at a particular substring, which is the comma character. This means that it will be used to chop up the individual words into individual array elements. Next, we're going to identify the length of the longest word, and the way that we're going to do that is iterate through all of the words and keep a note of which one will have an integer called longest, and we'll set it to 0 initially, and then we'll identify whichever one has the longest length so far will be used to update that variable. So it will only have to be updated if we find a word which is longer than any word we've ever found before. So let's use FORI tab in order to set up a for loop. It recognizes that the most recent data structure we have is that array of strings, and so it has set everything up for us. And what we're going to do here is if the words array at index I has a length, so we do dot length because we're dealing with a string, has a length which is greater than the value of longest, which is an integer, then we're going to want longest to be updated to be that exact number. This isn't going to happen very often in most cases. Okay, so having now identified the length of the longest word, we are now at the end of this for loop, and we can now revisit all words and output those that are the longest. So it's essentially a repeat visit to all of the words, and we can therefore recycle our for loop like we had before. And this time, if the word at that particular index has a length which is equal to the longest, that means that we're going to print it, SOUT tab, and we're going to print that particular word, not its length this time. So we'll replace that string with the word itself. It looks like that has completed the task. It looks like that has fully met the criteria. Now, when we go back to the main method, let's hit save. And when we go back, we see it's complaining at us, and it's saying that we're going to have to deal with the throws clause as well in the main method, and that puts that little issue to bed. Okay, let's run it to look for glitches and bugs. Okay, and it's saying that this is the longest word in the file, possibly created because of the way that we scrubbed out all of the spaces and so on. We've ended up joining two words together, which is absolutely fine. If we reopen the text file and we create some very, very long word, much longer than that one, save and close the text file, and we rerun our program, we should see then that that super long word comes out as the longest word. Generally speaking, I'm happy with this as the working solution to the problem, and I'm happy that we have remembered to, for example, close the text file as an important aspect of handling text files, and I'm happy that we've been able to solve the problem by being absolutely certain which is the length of the longest word, and then just simply revisit and identify those that are indeed the longest. There will be other approaches to this problem, and hopefully you've thought around the problem and maybe seen there will be different ways to do it.